Okay, I'm on a mediation break, and since I'm all dressed up and all ready to party, then I'm just going to go ahead and make a video. And this one, I'm going to talk about what is a free appropriate public education. Free, being the first word, tends to be sort of common sense. Means that as far as anything related to your child's educational program that they would be entitled to in order to receive a FAPE, not a FRAPE. Different. Frapes are delicious though, but this is a FAPE and they are not delicious. Okay, so a FAPE, free, would mean that this stuff has to be provided at no cost to the parent. Meaning the therapies, your child's program. It also includes transportation, guys. Transportation's a right under this law. So, for example, let's say that you want your child to ride the bus, but the school says, well, we don't offer bus transportation for your child, and they're telling you you have to transport your child. Well, if you transport your child, but yet you are wanting transportation or require that, let's say because you work, then the school system needs to enter into what's called a mileage contract with you in order to reimburse you at the federal rate. Some schools will do the state rate or whatever their local school rate is. That tends to be acceptable. But most of the time it's the federal rate, which is 57 cents a mile to transport your child to and from school. Okay? And why? Because that's part of that free, because your child can't access their school program unless they get there, of course. Okay, so the next one is appropriate. And with appropriate, it's a two-prong test. So you got to start with prong one. And prong one is that it's got to satisfy the IDEA's procedural requirements. And the procedure is what all the rules are. That's what the procedure is. You know, that they're giving you notice on time, that they're constructing the IEP in the way that is outlined in the IDEA. All those things are the procedure, okay? The second thing is going to be the substance of your child's program, or what we call the substantive standard. That's really the most important. But, of course, because in the definition of appropriate, why would they mention the requirement for the school or the necessity for them to follow the procedural requirements if that wasn't a serious thing as well? But I can tell you that when it comes to the legal analysis of whether FAPE was provided, yes, the procedure is important, but at the same time, the analysis standalone on that is, did the school system's lack of following procedure result in substantive harm to the child in their inability to make tangible progress and therefore have a denial of FAPE? So, you know, that's where within there's that embedded second analysis when it comes to that, you know, how much the procedural screw-ups on the part of the district ended up resulting in a denial of FAPE. But with regards to appropriate, number one is that's got to satisfy the IDEA's procedural requirements. I did make a couple notes because the second one gets a little bit more complicated, that it's got to be designed to allow the student to receive educational benefit. Now, educational benefit is tied to the Raleigh standard, the Supreme Court case of Raleigh, which used to be our standard before Andrew F. Now, we kept the term educational benefit from Raleigh, and we have now applied that within the confines of the new definition of Andrew F. So educational benefit is still there. And it's included in the definition, but at the same time, within the regulations and the IDEA itself, they don't define what educational benefit is. All right, so because it doesn't define it, and they don't determine how much service or intervention is required to meet the standard per your child's individualized needs. So at that point, that term educational benefit, you have to sit there and look, okay, since they don't define it within the regs and they don't sit there and list and determine just how much service time results in educational benefit, then how do you determine that? Okay, so then you have to go to Andrew F. and you have to go, okay, the IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress that is appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. That's the Andrew F. standard. There you go, tied to educational benefit. Let me read it again. The IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress that is appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. Okay, circumstances. What the heck does that mean? Well, what goes into developing the IEP? So this is where, in getting into the development of the IEP, you then get into the procedural requirements. All right, so there you go. You're back to the first prong of appropriate. They've got to follow the procedural requirements. Well, what goes into the procedural requirements? Well, we start with eligibility, right? We start with evaluations. We got to sit there and make sure that we're using the proper evaluations in order to get accurate baselines and understand your child's present levels of performance. Because the present levels of performance in following that procedure then allows the IEP team to understand the baseline, therefore establish goals for your child that are substantial in that they will make gains, or that they're given the opportunity to make gains. They're not guaranteed to make gains, but they're given the opportunity to make gains in light of their circumstances. Well, their circumstances are tied to their disability and the nature of their disability and how their disability impacts them. So therefore, you look at their disability and you say, well, what's the peer-reviewed, scientifically based treatments, therapies, or approaches that would be applicable to that disability or the cadre of disabilities if your child happens to be multiple disability? You start there because that would be your child's circumstances. For example, if your child, let's say, is moderately impacted with autism, and the school is putting your child in and your child has real language deficits in both receptive and expressive, but yet the school's just parking them in a general education class where they have little to no supports, then that is not FAPE for your child, because the school is not taking into consideration your child's circumstances, which are tied to their disability and the way that they learn and the peer-reviewed scientific approach that we know works for them. So the appropriate placement for a child like that would be a combination of both environments where they're supported, but at the same time, it could include things like ABA therapy, rote type of learning, those kind of things, because that would be the child's circumstances. But it all leads back to those evaluations. It all leads back to understanding and getting the present levels of performance right within the IEP in order to take the next step in developing the goals, and then taking that next step in determining what type of intervention is required, what curriculum, what type of teaching approach. If they need redirection, if they need their curriculum accommodated to the point where we're concentrating on mastery of concept alone, or let's say that rote repetitious learning that you tend to find through discrete trial training with ABA therapy, those all things have to be taken into consideration of how we accomplish that goal, present level of performance, how we're going to setting the goal, and then how we're going to reach that goal using which approaches, therapies, teaching style, what peer-reviewed scientific approach. And that needs to be written into the IEP with designated service minutes. How many times a week? Could be 1 time a week, 5 times a week. Where are we going to provide those services? Is it going to be as a pull-out service in special education, or are we going to push those services into general education? Those things all go into what is appropriate, because those things go into what's called educational benefit, because those things are tied to your child's circumstances, and recognizing what your child's circumstances in order to provide them the program that would help them make progress, tangible progress. Now, many of you are going to sit there and say, what the hell did you just say? But I'm telling you that that's how you come up with what's appropriate. And they're tied together. And I hope you can see why they're tied together with regards to the procedure. Following the procedure then results in them following what the law says in the development of the IEP. Do they have current baselines? or are they just sort of picking baselines out of the air? And I can tell you that happens in far too many of the IEPs that I look at and I analyze. If I can't decipher where they're getting these baselines from, then, at that point, that doesn't bode well for that next step of trying to gauge the goal. And I can tell you most of the time, this is where you lose parents. They don't understand where you got the baseline. And then at the same time, they don't understand these goals because they're not written in plain English for parents to really understand and track. But then once you get the baseline, you get the goal, that's where you get the services. What is the peer-reviewed scientific approach? And let's say the child has dyslexia and reading needs in written expression or comprehension. Let's say that those deficits relate over to areas where they're deficit in language and they're connected there. See, there you go. There's, in light of the child's circumstances brought into play, how are we addressing that? What needs to be inserted into there to address it? So once again, procedure. If procedure is followed, the substance is developed. And if the substance is developed by recognizing the child's circumstances and what we need to do there, that's appropriate.